Hidden behind the grand plantation walls, some of history's darkest abuses were committed. Acts so twisted they were erased from every official record. The fields shimmered under the southern sun, and the houses gleamed in white paint. But beneath the surface, power and violence moved unseen. White mistresses, celebrated for their grace and virtue, held a secret authority over the enslaved that history refused to name. Among the most vulnerable were the boys, too young to claim freedom, too powerless to resist, yet strong enough to labor. They became targets, forced into acts that stole their innocence, their dignity, and their future. What happens when power removes all choice and innocence is stolen in silence? In the American South of the 17th through 19th centuries, plantations were kingdoms of both wealth and cruelty. The social hierarchy was rigid: white men at the top, white women next, followed by enslaved adults, and at the very bottom, the enslaved boys. These boys were physically capable, but legally invisible. Their bodies belonged to others. Their lives were controlled by fear and obligation. They were watched constantly, disciplined for the smallest missteps, rewarded only when they served someone else's needs. Every step they took, every word they spoke, was framed by a world that denied them agency. How could such horrors remain hidden in plain sight for generations? White mistresses wielded the authority society granted them within the domestic sphere. They supervised work, rationed privileges, and maintained the invisible chain that bound the household. Boys who might have been allowed brief freedoms were coerced through threats, punishments, or the promise of minor indulgences. No law protected them. Families could be torn apart without notice. Resistance could lead to brutal consequences. Every act of compliance was survival, not consent. The asymmetry of power was absolute, leaving the children trapped in a cage their own bodies could not escape. Private spaces on the plantation became instruments of abuse. Attics, servant quarters, hidden rooms. These were places where the mistress's authority became a tool for freedom came was nearly impossible to reclaim. Even when the body survived, the soul carried what history tried to hide. The silence imposed by terror became a second prison, one that could not be chained or beaten, but could only be endured. Modern historians began to uncover the buried truths of these abuses through careful examination of slave narratives, WPA interviews, personal letters and diaries hidden in archives for centuries. Each fragment tells a story, often coded or incomplete, yet unmistakable in its meaning. Phrases like, "he was kept close to the house," or "she favored him," carried implications far darker than polite language allowed. Scholars recognize these acts not as isolated incidents, but as systemic abuses of power, sexual exploitation rooted in the structures of slavery rather than desire. The truth was buried, but not forgotten. Confronting these crimes challenged the long-held myth of the innocent Southern lady. The public, conditioned to see white women as virtuous and harmless, struggled to comprehend that some wielded authority in ways both coercive and sexual. For descendants of the enslaved, the revelations reopened wounds long thought silent. Families had carried whispers, suspicions, and unexplained gaps in their histories, now illuminated by evidence of abuse. The shock was deep, heartbreak pervasive, as communities began to grapple with the reality that power had corrupted innocence and that history had concealed it for generations. Dismissals, documentaries, and scholarship began to incorporate these narratives, giving voice to boys whose experiences had been erased. Historians worked to contextualize the abuse, showing that these acts were not anomalies but a product of the systemic dehumanization that slavery created. Academic discourse shifted, acknowledging that white mistresses, while constrained in their own social world, could exploit their authority in devastating ways. Public memory, long sanitized, slowly began to accept these uncomfortable truths. The psychological and cultural interpretations are stark. White mistresses often lived under strict patriarchy, denied meaningful agency, yet granted unchecked authority over enslaved children. Exploiting this is to confront the ways systemic power distorts human relationships and erases the most vulnerable. It is to recognize that the pain inflicted cannot be separated from the structures that enabled it. History tried to silence these boys, to render them invisible, to make their suffering unrecorded. Yet their stories demand to be heard. Remembering them is not about condemning all women of the past, nor about creating shame for descendants who did not commit these acts. It is about acknowledging the truth, restoring dignity to those whose lives were stolen, and understanding the corrosive power of unchecked authority. Power corrupted, innocence stolen, and the legacy remains. By facing these hidden crimes, by telling what was once buried, we ensure that the abuses are not repeated, that the stories are no longer silent, and that history carries the weight of truth, however uncomfortable it may be. Even decades after the plantations fell silent, the echoes of those hidden abuses lingered in memory and culture. Scholars, piecing together diaries and interviews, discovered patterns too disturbing to ignore. Boys entrusted to care. Boys punished for imagined defiance. Boys coerced in private corridors where no one could see. Every act was a weapon. Every favor a form of domination disguised as duty. Their innocence was never theirs to keep, and their suffering was never allowed to be spoken. The past had built invisible prisons that survived long after the chains were gone. The psychological scars were profound. Survivors carried shame, confusion, and fear that could never be named. They learned to hide their pain behind forced smiles, silence behind obedience. Families bore the weight of these unspoken horrors, generations inheriting trauma that could not be healed by simple freedom. Masculinity, trust, and self-worth were stolen alongside childhood. To speak of the abuse was impossible, yet to remain silent meant living with it every day, a wound that history refused to acknowledge. In confronting these histories, modern society must grapple with moral ambiguity and uncomfortable truths. White mistresses were neither monolithic villains nor innocent victims of circumstance. They were human beings, shaped by the very system they perpetuated. Across generations. The stories of these boys are not only historical accounts, they are moral imperatives. To remember them is to challenge ourselves to understand the depth of systemic abuse, the corrosive influence of unchecked authority, and the human cost of a society built on ownership and fear. Every narrative recovered is a small act of justice, an acknowledgement that history cannot be rewritten to protect comfort, but must instead confront truth. In the quiet of empty servant quarters, in the faded photographs and crumbling plantation halls, one can almost feel the weight of these lives. They demand to be seen, heard, and remembered. Power corrupted, innocence stolen, the legacy endured, and still it speaks. To ignore it is to repeat it. To face it is to honor those who survived, and those whose names may never be known. The truth is uncomfortable. The truth is disturbing. But only when we confront it can healing begin. Only when we remember can the descendants of pain and power finally find a way to reclaim dignity, from the silence history forced upon them. History does not forgive those who turn away. History demands that we look, that we speak, that we remember.